Okay, thank you very much. Now we are very, very excited. As we're coming to the end of our program, we have a wonderful keynote address for you today with Dr. Rooks. Dr. Rooks is an interdisciplinary scholar. She is the chair of and a professor in the Africana Studies at Brown University. She was at Cornell. She's now at Brown. She's founding director of the Segrenomics Lab at the school. Her work explores how race and gender both impact and are impacted by the popular culture, by social history and political life in the United States. She works on the cultural and racial implications of beauty, fashion, adornment, race, capitalism, and education. The author of 4 books and numerous articles, essays, and op-eds, Dr. Rooks has received research funding from the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson School, among many others. She lectures frequently at colleges and universities around the country. She's a regular contributor to popular sites such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Time Magazine, and NPR, one of my favorites. Her recent book is what we're highlighting today, and it is where she coined the term Segrenomics. And this book is Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education. She won an award for this book, a nonfiction award from the Hurston Wright Foundation. We are so proud and so thrilled to have Dr. Rooks with us today. Remember, we're going to take questions at the end before our closing. We're going to save some time for questions and answers with Dr. Rooks. So Dr. Rooks, welcome to North Carolina virtually.
Hi, hold on. Let me turn on actually start my video. Here we go. Can you see me?
Yes.
And you can hear me? You can hear me too.
Yes, ma'am.
Just checking the tech.
Yes.
And Yvonne, you're gonna, when I just say switch, you're gonna switch my slides for me, yes?
Yes, ma'am.
So I am so excited to be here, y'all. And I have had the chance to tune in for the whole conference. I think it's really important work that you're doing, and good on you getting up early on a Saturday morning to talk about democracy in schools and what we need to do to save them and to push back. This talk is actually going to focus on Detroit and school privatization in Detroit as a kind of lens for looking at democracy more broadly. I know all of the speakers and all of us who care about education and education reform and the United States at this point are very interested in talking about democracy. One of the things that the Biden presidency has had me sort of grappling with, only because, and this is not his fault as much as mine, I had some hopes around what was going to happen in education under a Biden presidency. And I thought that it would be a little more full-throated, a little more impactful right out the door. And I know he's got a lot on his plate, but the ground that is being gained by the school privatization forces, by AstroTurf parent groups, these parent groups that say they're grassroots groups. I'm sure y'all know this term, but I'm a professor, so I'm constantly trying to explain to make sure we're all thinking the same things. The AstroTurf parent groups are all these parent groups that are being funded by the Koch brothers and others that are saying they're fighting for their students and they're fighting for different kinds of choice. And they're being given certain kinds of access to policy that I didn't expect. So my point is, the idea of democracy as being only kind of one thing is something that I started to think about after that election. And to really think about the ways that there's a way that what we're watching with the Koch brothers and with the folks used to call the billionaire boys clubs, and the way that school privatization is so bound up with the wealthiest in the United States and globally, that's a form of democracy that we should pay some attention to. It's not the multi-status democracy, the one person, one vote ideal of democracy, but it is in fact a democratic process. And I think with the school privatization as well as other areas, we should pay some attention to it. So that's the context for what I want to introduce you to and who I want to introduce you to. One woman named Helen Moore, who, as I said, is an activist, 85 activist in Detroit. I'm sure all of our communities have a Helen Moore or a figure like Helen Moore. All of our communities have efforts that have looked similar to the one that I'm going to describe. All right, so here we go. Though ultimately settled for a, oh, you don't have to switch it. Well, you could leave it, just leave it. Though ultimately settled for a relatively modest sum and without providing a much desired legal precedent, for a brief period in April of 2020, a federal appeals court declared that American public school students had a constitutional right to something called an adequate education. The ruling said that the state of Michigan had been so negligent toward the educational needs of the students in Detroit that children had been deprived of access to literacy, quote unquote. The foundational skill, the court said, that allows Americans to function as citizens. As a result, the court believed that the state of Michigan had violated the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which described citizenship protections. All right, so click it again so the little movie hopefully will play. But the sound's not playing, but that's okay. That is really not, it is really not that big a deal. All right, so you didn't actually get to hear the cute little sound. It's the OJ singing this song, For the Love of Money, which I think is cute. But in any case, it's a visual representation of this term that I'm going to talk about, Segrenomics. So I went looking in the pages of that lawsuit that I described for examples to explain how the profit from racial and economic segregation, or Segrenomics, if wound around institutional organs like schools, cut off the lifeblood of democracy. What I found was a story about the wealthy and powerful turning both democracy and education policy themselves into tools that harmed as profoundly as the fact that schools supposedly didn't teach children to read. The impacts were educational, sure, but also psychological, emotional, spiritual, and physical. As Lawrence Tribe, a professor of constitutional law at Harvard University, noted about the Detroit case, the Detroit case gave the federal court system a chance to consider what he called, quote, the massive body of evidence demonstrating what underfunded schools do to children in attending them, including making them a permanent underclass, a term referenced in a prior US Supreme Court ruling involving education. Okay, next slide, please. In my work, I have so often unearthed such similar connections between the wealthy and the vulnerable in relation to health, education, segregation, and economic policies that I've literally begun to wonder if we should require impact statements, such as those found in some environmental policies, to go along with the educational policies we propose when we say we want to specifically help the most vulnerable children. Perhaps privileging health impacts and not just the test scores of children in struggling cities could lead to outcomes that will benefit the whole community, if not the nation. I study the past and present of educational policies that are often touted as cures or policy fixes. I'm at a point, though, where I cannot not notice the tears of children and young adults, the pain and the voices of grassroots activists and family caregivers, the incredulous stories told by journalists who cover the aftermath of such policy disasters. These supposed policy cures, much like some for the treatment of diseases like cancer, are often cures of a killing kind. Next slide, please. In this instance, the lawsuit uncovered and demonstrated the fact that many of the schools in Detroit were so decrepit that during the 2016-2017 school year, none of the buildings were in compliance with health and safety codes. One of the ways this non-compliance showed itself was that building temperatures in many schools regularly hovered at 90 degrees summer and winter, sometimes requiring schools to close in the summer with little notice when the heat would rise as high as 110 degrees. Indeed, on the first day of school in 2016, the heat was so bad in Detroit schools that several teachers and students in multiple schools threw up while others passed out. In the winter, it was often so cold that teachers and students wore coats and hats and scarves and gloves and layers of clothes when the temperatures plummeted so low that they could see their breath hanging in the air. In addition to the issues with the heating and cooling systems, the plaintiffs in the case affirmed and provided visual evidence that mice, roaches, and other vermin regularly inhabited their classrooms. And teachers reported that they had grown accustomed to cleaning up rodent feces in the morning before their students arrived. Even the water in many buildings was found to have been so contaminated with pollutants that it was unsafe to drink. In a few schools, the children suing the state said the ceilings in their classrooms were in such poor repair and that plumbing leaks were so often an issue that they'd grown used to keeping an eye on the ceilings of their buildings to avoid falling tiles during class. Classroom sizes had swelled to 50 to 60 students in the district, but the classrooms themselves only had desks for 40 students, the supposed maximum. When that happened, students sat on the floor or were forced to stand along the walls when class was in session. Teacher shortages meant that on some days, students could spend up to 3 class periods per day sitting in a gym. As a means of drawing attention to the lack of an adequate number of teachers in her school, one teacher took to standing in front of the building, handing out flyers to parents as they came to pick up their children that asked them to, quote, ask your child if they even had a teacher today, end quote. And perhaps the most notable example of the severity of the teaching shortages in the district, at one school, 8th grade students were put in charge of teaching 7th and 8th grade math classes for a month because there were no math teachers available to teach the children themselves. Next slide, please. Given these realities, it should not surprise that in 2019, only 7% of students in the Detroit public schools read at or above grade level, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The percentage of Detroit students overall who performed at or above the NAEP proficient level that same year was 6%. Today, nearly half of all adults in Detroit, about 47%, are considered functionally illiterate. In responding to the lawsuit, the current superintendent of public schools in Detroit, who was not part of it, said, quote, next slide, please, this lawsuit speaks to years of educational injustice in Detroit, linked to imposed government structures that strip the city of local control. He continued, no district in this country experienced the brutal history of what Detroit public schools endured. More importantly, what children endured. He concluded, the state took over the district without the people's consent, and the district went backwards. Adults need to be held accountable for that. And more importantly, today's children cannot suffer the same consequences. Next slide, please. Refusing to suffer such consequences silently is what led the students, caregivers, teachers, administrators, parents, and a community activist named Helen Moore to approach the law firm in the first place to file the literacy suit. When asked about her motivation, Moore said, "How can you expect someone, anyone in our country, to be engaged in civics or in the process at all if they can't read? You can't take part in our democracy unless you can read. So why is it that you all have these people working so hard to make sure Black students are unable to read?" Next slide, please. Helen Moore is 85 and has lived in Detroit for 81 of those years. She became an educational, wait, did you switch slides? All right. She became an educational organizer and activist in the city in 1969 when the first of her children began to attend school. By then, the factories and then many of the middle class and white residents had begun moving to the suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them, and beginning a downward economic slide of education funding while creating intractably segregated geographic landscapes. Though Moore believes that history is important context for understanding the conditions documented in the 2016 lawsuit, she says the beginning of the story about the social, emotional, physical, financial, and psychic impact of education policies and privatizations on the health of the city's residents began in 1994. That was the year that organized community members defied the mayor of Detroit, along with the president of the teachers union, the governor of the state of Michigan, and the legislature, and organized a campaign to tax themselves to raise $1.5 billion in bond money. It would be used to repair dilapidated schools, build new ones, and fund needed curricular and pedagogical initiatives for children in the district. The vote was designed to offer what community members saw as an opportunity to provide their children with educational facilities and curricular enhancements similar to those found in the suburbs. That it passed stunned state and local leaders who had refused to support it. Next slide, please. Moore says, "This story has never been told. People kept telling us about our schools, our community, our kids, but the story has never been told. This is history no one is going to talk about unless we expose it." Proposition S, the largest bond issue ever passed in the city, relied on a determined grassroots campaign. One of the community organizers, Dolores Smith, the head of the Citizen for Bond Committee, says of the work she and her 75 members did, quote, "We went door to door, we telephone banked, we went school to school, church to church, everything," end quote. In explaining his opposition to the bond, the president of the Greater Detroit Chamber of Commerce said, quote, "Our concern continues regarding the planning, management, and cost impact of a $1.5 billion program in the fragile economic situation which exists in Detroit," end quote. James Elliott, then the president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, questioned whether the money would be spent wisely. At that point, according to journalists, education scholars, teachers, and community activists, Detroit schools were actually poised to become a model for how to transform struggling urban majority of color school districts into world-class educational institutions. At the time, the city had a supportive school board who had worked collaboratively with school leaders to design an innovative curriculum that included foreign languages, vocational arts, fine art, music, and college prep. All they needed, organizers and school leaders said, was for voters who actually sent their kids to the schools was to provide the funding to solidify their vision. So campaign organizers took their case directly to Detroit voters, encouraging them to go to any school, any city school, to see conditions for themselves. They asked voters to approve the bond so the children in the city could become competitive and have the same opportunities as other children in the suburbs and throughout the state. Though it caught seasoned political insiders completely by surprise, the bond issue passed with 60% of eligible voters in the majority Black city turning out to support city schools and to tax themselves. Next slide, please. A few years after the bond issue passed and construction and repair had begun in the schools, the folks in Detroit got even better news. In addition to a $93 million surplus in their general operating budget, in 1997, their test scores had begun to rise, posting sharp gains in science and writing, and overall proficiency levels had soared as well. When the school superintendent who had been against the bond proposal sang a line, even the school superintendent who had been against the bond proposal sang a line from the James Brown song, "I Feel Good," when asked about this reversal of fortune. By 1999, all of that changed. Members of the business community, including those in construction who saw themselves as shut out of access to the $1.5 billion in bond money, took their grievances to Governor Engler's office. They were, after all, amongst his largest donors. Surprising many, Engler in a 1999 speech to the Economic Club of Detroit declared the financially solvent district to be bankrupt, heading in the wrong direction, dilapidated and failing, and announced that he was stepping up and stepping in to help. He said the changes he was about to make were not about, quote, race, money, or power, end quote, but that, quote, the reforms were about the children, end quote. He then announced that he was dissolving the democratically elected school board and installing a reform board to save the district. This board would, he said, report directly to him and not be responsible to the voters in the city of Detroit. The first thing the new reform board did was determine that none of the $1.5 billion in bond money would go to individual schools so that principals could use the funds to make curricular and pedagogical enhancements. No, now all of it would go to construction and infrastructure. They determined that one of the white construction firms that had taken their case to the governor asking for assistance was now to have sole discretion and oversight how all of the money would be spent. The reform board also fired all three of the Black construction firms that were to have received 50% of funds resulting from construction. Next slide, please. The second thing the new reform board did was to pass rules limiting the amount of community input they would allow at meetings. They banned signs, they banned protests. Activists and residents said the action was driven solely by the interests of corporations, not the interests of people in schools. Over the next 3 years, the reform board took a district with a $93 million surplus into a $250 million debt and spent all of the bond money. It took until 2006, but Moore and the other school and community activists organized a recall election to return school governance to an elected school board. Voters said resoundingly that they wanted to go back to an elected board to decide curriculum, policy, and budgets. They won that vote, but within 3 years, given the $300 million debt hamstringing the district, the state again took control. This time it was a Democratic governor, Jennifer Granholm, who made the decision. She also appointed an emergency financial manager to address decisions about the overwhelming debt. The first emergency manager was named Robert Bobb. He immediately said his job had to extend from financial matters to curriculum and personnel. Though the school board disagreed and filed suit saying he had exceeded his power and authority relative to academics, they won in court. But just 60 days later, Rick Snyder won the race for governor and the GOP took control of the legislature. It didn't take long for them to pass an emergency manager law, which suspended democracy relative to school governance and specifically gave Robert Bobb complete control of every aspect of the school district. It stripped the board again of all their power, exempted Bobb from the Open Meetings Act, and made clear he could only be removed from his position by the governor, not by voters in the state. Next slide, please. Of course, Moore and other activists moved quickly to organize a repeal of the emergency manager law by referendum. Though they only needed 150,000 signatures, just to be on the safe side, they submitted 204,000 for certification, believing they needed to have a healthy cushion in order for it to succeed. In the end, it wasn't the number of names that were called into question, but rather the size of the font that they used to prepare the paperwork. The law said that the font on the petition had to be 14 point, but their petition, they were told, the font was only 13.75 point. And so lawmakers in Lansing threw it out. Next slide, please. Undeterred, the activists organized a statewide referendum to repeal the emergency manager law. To succeed, they needed to have a majority of the 81 counties in Michigan vote for the repeal. Everyone told the activists that there was no way that they would get all those white counties to support them. But in the end, 77 of 81 counties stood with the people of Detroit and voted down the emergency manager law, along with its absolute power. Next slide. However, 2 weeks later, Governor Snyder rolled out a new emergency manager law to replace the ones voters throughout the state rejected through the democratic process. He had his staff write an almost identical bill, merely adding the provision that this one could not be repealed by referendum and that each emergency manager could only serve for 18 months each, as opposed to indefinitely. When asked about this move and its seeming intent to thwart the clear will of voters, Snyder said simply, quote, "We follow the law. There's no issue," end quote. Next slide, please. There were 5 emergency managers overall, and I'll save you the ins and outs of every little thing that happened between 2009 and 2016. But the upshot of this state oversight and various policies is that while in 1999, Detroit had been in the middle of the educational pack relative to the United States, by 2019, it was 50th. Next slide, please. By the time the citizens of Detroit finally got control of schools returned, there was more debt than any of them could believe. Also, 200 of Detroit schools have been closed by various emergency managers, and over-reliance on standardized tests had labeled whole swaths of the community as deficient, triggering various provisions of federal policy that required traditional public schools be replaced with charter schools, thus shrinking the district and draining the enrollment that ensures districts stay solvent. Instead, the district's deficit is currently almost $500 million, and its long-term debt is $1.5 billion. They will be paying this debt back until 2038. And it's the children who've been most hurt by these policy games and policy cures. I've been creating and working through, next slide, please. I've been creating and working through and thinking about these policies said to be enacted to aid students in districts such as these. I use a construct called killing cures as a way to explain why community engagement is crucial for policymakers to think about, specifically in relation to our most vulnerable communities. We know and understand that racism is toxic. It's time for us to act like we know that the environments racism creates are equally so. At almost every turn of the decades-long battle, if officials had seen education policy as health policy and health as a key element of their policy prescriptions, things would have turned out very differently. It's time to ask what social policy would look like if it were crafted with a view toward ensuring the social, mental, emotional, and physical health of those most deeply impacted by it. Next slide, please. At the very least, policymakers crafting educational policies should be required, like the oath medical doctors swear, to first do no harm. Many of the policies undergirding this dismantling of education and interruption of democracy in Detroit make clear the issue is not merely that schools in the city had failed to adequately teach young people and children to read. There's also a story here about the impact of racism when wrapped in educational policies, the effects of which made many of the parents and aunts and grandparents and students, oh good Lord, in the schools uh, this is about that may okay. There's also a story here about the impact of racism when wrapped in educational policies, the effects of which made many of the parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and students in that city not just doubt and question themselves, but also to doubt elected officials and the ability of the vulnerable to ever triumph over the powerful. And in the end, they doubted the efficacy of democracy itself. Moore says seeing the state take over and then dissolve other predominantly Black school systems in the state was hard, but just made her group fight harder. In that way, the whole story is about what writer Kaisi Lyman, next slide please, has described as wounds and scars from battles won that hurt more than those from battles lost. If there's a triumph here, it's the fact that there were, if even for fleeting moments, battles that were won, which is in large part due to the spirit of the 85-year-old civil rights activist, tactician, and organizer-in-chief, Helen Moore. Right now, Moore is shifting her focus from education advocacy to the Electoral College, a process she doesn't really understand and just learned about when she served as an elector for Michigan in the last presidential election. Reflecting on the experience, she says, maybe I'm missing something, but why can't we just allow the voters' decision to stand? All this extra stuff seems to make the process more complicated than it needs to be. Next slide, please. This joining of voting rights and educational rights is interesting to me because there are similar, if less extreme, stories in highly segregated post-industrial cities in the South, Midwest, and East Coast with large populations of Black and Latinx students in their school systems. Interestingly, all of these cities whose vote counts we waited breathlessly to report in order to determine the winner of the most recent presidential election, Atlanta, next slide please, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, have stories about the health impacts of the past 3 decades of educational policies, promising there would be, quote unquote, no child left behind, and that they could compete to, quote unquote, race to the top, or that, quote unquote, every child would succeed. Each has left teachers and community members and activists in a steady state of protest and pushback. If we ask the Helen Moores of the world to write our legislative future, I'm sure it would look very different. Oh, okay, so now I've like screwed up my slides. So just scroll the slides through. That's actually the end of the talk. Okay, actually, wait, go back. So I can narrate some of these talks if you don't mind. I'm sorry, go back a little more, go back a little more, a little more, a little more. Okay, all right. So the thing that I find particularly notable about this is the title of the talk is about they tried to take our democracy and so we fought them back with ours, and that's like a thinking about the grassroots organization. So you have, you know, governors and corporate folks and, you know, who are making democracy work in the way that they want to. And then you have these folks who people are not really ever used to listening to, who are using the democracy that we believe, the democracy of the vote, the democracy of organizing, the democracy of you don't like people, you vote them out. You don't like something, you organize and vote them out. And the story in Detroit is they did repeatedly organize and vote people out, or organize and vote out policies. They kept winning. They won and they won and they won. And the goalposts just kept getting changed. So in the end, they were in worse shape than where they started. So next slide. So like somehow I got all out, but what I'm trying to focus on is for activists, what it makes them feel like, for kids, for when communities stand up and do everything that history and the Constitution, that notions of right and wrong tell us need to be done. You convince people, you protest, you march, you make an argument, you engage, you vote. Those are the acceptable forms of change making. When over and over again, you see that something else is happening behind closed doors, that the powerful and the wealthy are able to get their agendas on the table despite them being democratically told, electorally told, this is not what we want. There's an impact that's doing a kind of damage to democracy that I think activists and organizers, it's taking a toll that we should pay some attention to, because it gets harder to get up and fight again when you win and you still lose. Next slide. So what I found particularly poignant reading this lawsuit, and I've actually gone on to start gathering up lawsuits that students have been filing in the last 2 or 3 years to talk about their pushback against privatization. But the education this is giving all of these student activists, you wouldn't know it from watching the news, you wouldn't know it from the press very often, but students are organized, vocal, out in front. They have an analysis. And but one of the things that they're learning, again, in places like Detroit, where you win, you organize and you win, and it's still not good enough, they start to learn a very different lesson about democracy and about citizenship than I think we should pay some attention to. What is all of this advance of privatization? What are the lessons our kids are taking from that? What does it make them, how does it make them feel they're valued? What is the lesson of citizenship that they're taking from that? Certainly not that all citizenship is equal. Certainly not. Certainly not that all democracy is equal. But we don't talk about that enough. So they're left to kind of struggle with it and deal with the mental health aspects. Next slide. So this is one of the lead plaintiffs, and he was one of the first, and this is another thing, so many who graduate from these reform districts and are among the first in their families to try to go to college, and they get to college, community college, 4-year college, and they simply can't compete. And so to go from this high of being told that you're the best, yes, everybody else in this district is failing. Nobody else really knows how to succeed in the ways that you do. But you've worked and you've kept your head down, and you go off to college, and the first thing you recognize is you can't read. You can't be in college because they're not set up for students who can't read, who have learned, who are being taught by students a year older than them, who themselves can't read. The dysfunction that is taking place in too many of these schools and districts that we're not paying enough attention to the human impact is part of what I am looking at, what it meant for this young man to be an activist, to feel like he won something, to be proud of his district, to be proud, and to show up at college, and he was not able to compete. Next slide. Is there another one? There should be another one. And many of these young people in the in the oral histories and then the documents for this court case, as well as others, students in New York City filed a lawsuit last year, I think it's been about a year, saying that they wanted an anti-racist education. That's just a different way getting at the same thing. They were kind of like, what we see is like, we want an anti-racist education, please. Students in Rhode Island filed a lawsuit talking about how bad the schools were and how privatization efforts were harming them. These lawsuits are getting no kind of real traction, no kind of real attention, no kind of real analysis or care in terms of, again, looking at what this privatized education, what these schemes, how they're harming on an emotional level. So this young woman, just starts saying, what this whole thing made her feel is just that she wasn't good enough. Maybe it was being from Detroit, maybe it was just her smarts, but she just wasn't good enough. This should not be the lesson that our education system is giving. Next one. Is there another kid? Yeah. And then this young woman was specifically in the amendments, in the documents that were submitted with the Detroit literacy lawsuit. She specifically talked about how if she responded to any of the situations that she found herself in, if she was chosen that day to be the one to pick up the rodents, they took turns picking up dead rodents that had been killed overnight, or if she complained about the fact that there was no running water in the bathrooms, if she said it's bad, I don't want to sit here on the floor in my classroom, that very often the speaking out, the saying, this is crazy, this is wrong, we should not be sitting on the floor because there's not enough classrooms because we're so overcrowded, very often she or the students would be labeled as the problem, not the system as the problem. But she, and to speak out, to speak back, to sort of claim your humanity in that way, created you as a problem. Next one, is there another one? I know how I got these so out of order. So yeah, this is a veteran teacher who, in the longer version of this, is really a bulwark. I mean, he's really in the high school that he works in, he's like holding them together in terms of their feelings, like that they can make it, they can do it, keep fighting, keep your head down, go. And at some point, he's just like, he had to retire. He said he just couldn't do it anymore. The emotional toil, the constant fighting. And again, in the Detroit case, the constant winning, they're winning. They keep winning and nothing changes. Things get worse. The powerful end up even more on top. And he said, he really, when we talk about how somehow morality and ethics will always win, to recognize what it takes to bend it. It doesn't bend. That arc of the moral universe does not bend on his own. It takes work and it takes effort and it takes understanding the losses, understanding the length of the struggle, in order to have the fortitude to actually fight and win and not fight and just get tired. Next one, I think this might be it. Yeah, that's it. So I'm sorry, I had to narrate the end because somehow I got them all out of order, but thank y'all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Rooks. Yvonne is coming back on with us.
There I am.
There we are.
Well, so one of the things that I enjoyed reading in your book, Dr. Rooks, was looking at the kind of the history of where we've kind of gone since, Brown versus the Board of Education, which is in the 50s. Have we gone full circle? Are we right back where we started? Except now we have a corporate plan for actually segregating our schools.
Yeah, I think the one of the hard truths, if you pay some attention to the disconnect between the narrative in Brown v. Board, and then what happened is it would lead you to believe that there was widespread support for ending segregation. It would lead you to believe that white parents, or really a lot of Black parents, that this was what people were calling for. And some places, segregation took place, Brown v. Board was implemented, people said, sure, fine, great, and just went about the business of figuring out how to do it. But the sustained kind of pushback around the idea that you're going to provide the same kind of education to white students and Black students, I don't know that it was ever quite as popular as some of us would be led to believe. And so, yes, we've kind of come full circle, so that if in Brown v. Board, what you had was this idea of segregation as a harm, the Mamie and Kenneth Clark studies that showed that educational segregation was harming Black kids and white kids because they saw themselves as inferior, or white kids were being taught that Black kids were inferior. And so social science and this idea of health was a big part of Brown v. Board. Part of what I'm saying is, we don't even think about what these policies, how they're impacting kids beyond test scores. What we talk about very often, or what those who are sort of in charge of putting pieces in place, what they want to talk about are test scores. Since the 80s, everything has become about test scores. I'm not sure that everybody even really recognizes it was not always the case that test scores, were the mark, of progress. It's in the 80s, the late 70s and 80s, that you start to hear that schools are broken, and the only ways we can know if they're broken or not, that U.S. schools, public schools in the United States, are just broken. They're fails. They're doing an awful job. Nothing is good with them. There's a series of reports that come out that that say this, and the only fix for that is to have some kind of testing, folks wanted you to think, that was national and that you could compare. So we are in terms of segregation. I mean, it's no great insight to say, that we are as segregated as a nation in schools as we were in the 1960s, once Brown v. Board began to get implemented. I think, though, that the fatigue factor means we just don't care as much. We're sort of like, well, we tried it. There was a whole court case. There was battles over busing. People had we really tried. There was an effort made here. It clearly has not worked. What it would take to make it work, people who are doing okay with public schools have no interest in. And so I think we may be back at that point. But I think the fact that, 60 something years later, we are back at that point, means that I'm not sure that there is even a will to try in a large scale. That sounds bleak and dark, which is not good. But I do think there's some bleakness.
Well, I do think that also is what, to me, compounds a situation we have in terms of advocacy around public education, is that we have a parade of parents, right? Parents come in with their kids in kindergarten, first grade. They're invested, they're interested, and they're kind of part of the advocacy community. And then and a number of years later, they move out. And then we kind of start over again, building our audience of support. And so I guess one of our challenges is how do we build more global or support outside of the parents themselves? Because we seem to be, as you were saying, we kind of get a little spark with a new group of parents that come in with the advocacy work, and then it goes away. Any suggestions for us on how we get to this larger community to let them understand what's at crisis, the crisis we're in right now?
Yeah, I think that it is difficult, quite frankly, to convince everyone we're in a crisis. I mean, a lot of people think we're in a crisis. They just identify what the issue is in different ways. So for some parents, the crisis is that you have this, they call government schools. Government schools are what are making the crisis, like public schools, like their derogatory term for that's the crisis as far as they're concerned. Other people, it's the crisis is what's being taught in the schools, as we're seeing this rise of critical race theory. So, I mean, that rise of anti anything talking about race or racism in schools, that's the crisis. We need to dismantle the schools or more privatize or give more choice, like let people make decisions because they have to run from critical race theory. You have others who are, that parents are being shut out. When I very first I just started a new job at Brown, and I had barely been here 5 minutes, and I got a call from some folks in Connecticut about 20 minutes away who were saying that all of a sudden their school board was being taken over by these parents who they didn't know. They seemed to be coming from not Connecticut, who were telling them that their schools were broken and really making this push on the school board. And really, so those parents were kind of like, wait, we didn't know the schools were broken. So maybe we need to stand down from some of the pushback against privatization and listen to them. And the people calling me were kind of like, they're making ground, they're gaining ground. What do we do to push back? And I think the idea of school really means so many different, public school means so many different things to people. It does not, as much as I think it has a kind of unified, it's about educating people for citizenship. It's a public right. It's for, educating people for work as well, but maybe not as aggressively as some think. So, there are things I think we share and what we think public schools should be doing. But what I would say is I think we have to state that as almost statements of principles, because those things are not shared. Not everyone wants, listening to Carol Burris's talk, and the numbers of talking about the basis schools or some of the schools that make sure that they have a certain kind of student body. That's what parents want. Some parents, actually want a student body that is made up of economically similar and racially similar, homogenous groups. That's what they want their tax. So when you say public schools to them, they're trying to figure out why it's not that. I think recognizing how far apart we are on some basic terms and concepts, and not acting like when we say public school, we all even mean the same thing. And that's for progressive parents too. You have lots of progressive parents who are kind of like, I just want my kid to be benefited. Like I want to make sure they're being set up in the right. I'm not trying to keep others from getting that as well, but my focus is on my kid getting as much benefit as possible. So I do think, though, that pointing out to all parents that it just makes education more ineffective and more expensive when we allow it to be privatized could actually work. Because you're trying to do more with less when you allow privatization to run amok. And pointing out to them that they do not, in fact, have the same kind of access and ability to advocate for their kids in many of these privatized models. It really is my way or the highway, or they're kind of like, take your kid out and go, I don't care. We'll get more, like we'll backfill, like figuring out what it is that parents actually mean when they're saying public education, what they actually want for their kids, and organizing those around that. Maybe more than just assuming we all mean exactly the same thing. I know that was long-winded, and I will keep it much shorter, I promise.
Well, we do have a few more questions. I mean, people have been very inspired by hearing about students filing lawsuits and so forth. And tell us, how can we adults, how can we promote helping our young people do more to speak up for their own rights in public education?
Yeah, young people actually ended up, I think because in my book Cutting School, I focused on, I ended talking about some of the organizing that students were doing on their own behalf. I have over the years developed really good relationships with numbers of youth organizers in different states around different kinds of issues. And the thing that they are constantly saying is that adults really need, whatever you're organizing around in education, if you're doing it and not trying to reach out to and be in some kind of community with students. There are no, like, I don't know that there are any states where there aren't students organized at some level. And some, they're very organized into national or statewide or countywide groups. And others, they're just sort of in individual schools asking for, pushing back, but they're in touch with each other. Like, there's an entire almost underground is probably going too far because you can find it, but there's a whole network of students from middle school on who are around restorative justice issues, testing, who are anti-privatization, because to the extent that they are overwhelmingly kind of poor first generation working class, these are the schools, they see a better shot at fixing what's broken with traditional public schools than acquiescing to privatization. So they're a kind of natural ally to groups that are mostly adults who are organizing. And what they would say is, reach out to us, find us. We're not that hard to find. Ask us, what we see. Ask us. And they're frustrated at how often, as they say, adults, it's funny to hear, like, they almost use adults as a weapon when they say, and adults, like, and I'm always kind of like, oh my God, now, like, being an adult is, just being an adult. But they're kind of like, adults never ask us. They want to talk about, we're the ones that are sitting in schools every day.
Well, Dr. Rooks, you're actually inspiring me a little bit here now. I think that I'm personally going to kind of recommit myself to trying to connect more with our students. I remember a time back over a decade ago in Wake County, North Carolina, when there had been a school board takeover by the conservative right. And one of the greatest advocacy groups that pushed back and actually helped create the change on our school board were students. We're actually students themselves here in high school, most of them, some in middle school, who spoke up and said, we want diverse schools. We want to educate ourselves. We want to know about other social, cultural, racial issues. We like our diverse public schools. And so we might need to refocus ourselves as adults. Yes, better about how we can work with some of our students, because they have a lot of vested interest and maybe a better picture and understanding of the vested interest than their parents or other adults in the community.
Yeah, so, not too long ago, just recently, there was a principal in a district in Texas, one of the smaller districts, not like Austin or Dallas, but it's one of the smaller districts, who is a Black man, and he ran afoul of parents because they said he was allowing critical race, he was allowing racism to be taught in schools, and he was making white students uncomfortable. He's the principal, he wasn't teaching any kids himself, but that he was allowing teachers to engage in this kind of behavior. And at the school board meeting, the half of the students, of the middle school students enrolled at the school across 3 different grades, showed up to say, none of that is happening. Like, they were talking back to their parents. They were saying, you're not listening to us. We're here to tell you that what you're saying is happening, that what he did, that has never happened. We're not experiencing that. You're just completely making that up. And the adults, basically silenced the kids, told them you could have one representative speak. No, you all can't speak, and you're confused. And and sat the kids down and commenced to still firing. They ended up firing him for something the kids said was not happening.
Right.
So we see it, kids do have a perspective if we let them speak. And I think there's some ways that some of the politics we're seeing is about parents wanting to sort of reassert their control over the ideas. They don't want their kids to think things that they don't think. They don't want their kids to believe that public schools are just fine when they want to homeschool them or whatever it is. And they want to control not just where school is happening, but what is specifically taught in it. So yes, that's a long way of saying I do think I'm always going to say find some young folks and find out from them what they want, which is not the only thing, but it's something.
Well, it's certainly going to be something I'm going to try to spend a little bit more time
Hey.
on. I don't want you to leave today without talking a little bit about, we've been talking a lot about your book and in our organization, and a little plug for folks. If you make a donation, we send you a book from Dr. Rooks.
Yes.
But
So,
it's also available on the website. But tell us a little bit. I want the public to understand a little bit about this book you wrote and what inspired you, and also, Dr. Rooks, what can we all take from how we can stop this dismantling of our public schools?
So I started to write this book in 2016, which was this kind of momentous year. Oh, no, wait, didn't I? Yeah, no, I started writing in 2009. It went to the publishers in 2016. And the thing about, I was teaching at Princeton University at the time, and Princeton was sort of ground zero for school privatization because of Teach for America. The founder of Teach for America, Wendy Kopp, had gotten her degree at Princeton writing a senior thesis that was all about saying we need a public teacher corps that goes into these areas. It's sort of like the Peace Corps, but it will be for teachers. And went on to get funding to do Teach for America. So when she would come to campus, she had like rock star status. Like she would be walking across campus and there'd be just people like really swooning in her path, not to mention following behind her. Like she was just a complete celebrity. And I was teaching a class at the time in Trenton, which is about 20 miles from, or 20 minutes from Princeton, and is a struggling school district, majority Black, troubled, all of the things. And my class was all about how you need to include parents and caregivers and community members and kids in conversations about what you want to do with schools. And at this time, I had a student who actually ended up founding an organization, Students for Ed Reform, I think it was called. She dropped out of school to found it, but she came and she sat with me and she was like, you seem to be at odds with the whole school reform movement, because what we all know, and it was, they were having conferences and getting jobs and founding organizations. She's like, but what we all know is that if poor families and Black families actually cared about the education of their kids, the schools wouldn't look so bad. Like we see clearly and empirically that the issue is that parents and kids who are Black and poor just don't care what happens with their kids. And we're in there trying to help them. And you keep saying to include the parents and the kids and why would we do that when we know what works? These forms of school and no excuses and all of these things work. We have the imprint of the federal government and all these Fortune 500 CEOs and like all of these governors saying we know what works. Why do you keep telling people that something else needs to happen? And in a lot of ways, what the book ends up being is a hugely long response to her and that question. And because it was me trying to figure out, how did we get to a point where an earnest young white woman, a wealthy, earnest, and she was very earned, like she was really like a child's zip code should not determine their education. And like she was really feeling, and this is a civil rights issue, you know, like she was sincere. Um, but how did we get to a point where she felt like, without knowing, and by her own admission, she went to private schools herself. She grew up in Virginia in a very segregated setting. She held no malice toward Black people, but she hadn't grown up with many in her social circles. She had certainly grown up, you know, because she's Southern, seeing Black ladies. She's not like some people who were like, I never saw any Black people. That wasn't her. But she never been in social. But how did you get to this point where someone who's that disconnected from the system and the people that you are talking about is now going to save them? And how? Because in 2009, we got Waiting for Superman, we got Race to the Top, and I think that's the year Zuckerberg decided to save Newark. So all of this was happening right around the same time.
Right.
And say,
Go ahead.
yeah,
I'm sorry.
and so the book, I kept backing up, trying to find a period of time when you did not have government and wealthy white people and corporations trying to determine what poor kids needed how they needed to be educated, how Black kids needed to be educated, how all of these sort of masters of industry and politics, how it came to be that they were advocating for educations for other people's kids that bore no relationship to the education that they advocated for their own kids. And so I start in post-Reconstruction, when publicly financed compulsory education really kind of hits the scene. Then we got this idea that all kids have to go to school for some period of time, and we're going to get states property taxes to pay for them. And so, yeah, I kept backing up going, okay, there has to be a period where you did not have these groups of people sort of saying, you know, we know what education is and no one else cares about it. And what I came away with is that has never been the case. I mean, actually, what we're looking at now, this dismantling, we're in a late stage of it, but it's been on the policy table. It's been in the air for a very, very long time. It was speeded up by Brown v. Board in its aftermath, but there's never been this equality of access to education.
Dr. Rooks, that is a great summary of some of the things that you've documented in your book. And I think really compelling to me, and several folks put in the question box, is this whole concept of the people making the decisions and what they're going to spend on paying teachers, what they're going to spend on paying the very brightest in their companies, and what they want to pay teachers is a conflict, right? What they want to spend on their own child having resources, books, notebooks, computers, versus what they want to spend on public children's education. Mm-hmm. So this conflict you talk about, that we have billionaires who would never choose these same settings for their own children, I think is really a fascinating point to make.
Yeah, you know, a few years ago, it's funny because I was in and around New York. Like I said, I was writing this book. I was at Princeton, and then I lived in upstate New York. And New York, before the pandemic, didn't really have any kind of virtual education. Like it was just a non. So I would talk about the rise of virtual education in Florida, and I mean, part of what I talk about is where the roots of virtual charter schools come from, and how they started getting passed around. And the folks in New York were always like, you know, we don't have that. Like, we don't even know what you're talking about. That just sounds crazy. And of course, now after COVID, you know, everybody is now familiar with some of the inherent deficiencies of only trying to teach online. But a few years ago, there was an article that came out that talked about how all of these Silicon Valley folks who were deeply involved with education the rocket ship, and like all these failed efforts that people are like, we're going to personalize education, use the computer. You can stay home and not get bullied, use the computer. These Silicon Valley folks and hedge funders who join forces to say, now we're going to use technology as a cheaper but better, more personalized way of educating. This article is talking about how the schools that most of them send their kids to don't even let them use technology, much less spend all day, sitting in front of the computer from age 5, whole districts. But that they're kind of like going to places where they want their kids to experience play, to learn to develop their imaginations, to have free play. They're sending them to Montessori schools, and it's an antithesis of what they are prescribing for other kids and other people's children, for rural districts and urban districts that are struggling with infrastructure and teachers. But they're full-throated saying, but your kids could benefit from that. And you see it all over in terms of curriculum. The kids who I've been teaching for some decades now and who come from, Tony kind of prep schools, they're all over being able to talk about the history of the United States and settler colonialism and genocide, like all of the things that now you're hearing. We don't want our kids indoctrinated. At the top schools in the country, they spend a lot of time talking about democracy and the foibles of the founders and the real history. And they spend a lot of time with that. It is not, some sort of no. And those are the schools that people who sort of run things globally, or, these hedge funds, these companies, those are the schools they're sending their kids to. But they're funding efforts to make sure that other people's kids don't get it. Like that disconnect is one that I think is a fundamental threat to democracy. When we see that people want what they want for themselves is very different from what they're prescribing, what they're forcing on, what they're paying for other people, that alone, I think, should make us take a minute and just sort of say, well, why? If technology is not good enough for your kid, you think that developing the imagination and developing creativity is better for your kid, and having research says is better for your kid, or the dirty little secret that most private schools do not have standardized tests in the way that public school kids experience them. They may have some kind of test. It's not what public schools have been mandated to do, but those are the schools you send your kid to, while you make sure everybody else's kid has to start being tested in the 3rd grade and is doing it twice a year, and that it matters, that it has high stakes. Why don't we just provide? I mean, that's one of the questions I keep coming back to, or in cutting school, is what if we just educated poor kids, middle-class kids, traditional public school kids, the way we do the wealthiest kids? If we use the educational practices in the schools and the classrooms that these global elite have deemed, the curriculum that they have deemed good enough for their kids, what if that was the basis for what we decided our kids needed? The smaller classrooms, the highly qualified teachers, the imaginative instead of lockstep curriculum, to encourage and support, to say at the end of the year, here are the things your kids need to know. You get there in the way that makes the most sense for your classroom of kids, which is what happens. I sent my kid to private school. I know this is what happens. And that disconnect that we are, in a sense, fighting for less and less for our kids in public school, fighting for less and less space, fighting for just, could you test them a little less? Could you come up with some way? Could we just have a few fewer students in a classroom? Can we pay teachers enough so that we get teachers who can stabilize the aspects of their life so that they can focus on our kids? Like, these are small, to me, these are small things. It should not take a revolutionary type movement, a grassroots movement, to get these basics when, you know, you wouldn't accept many of these policies you wouldn't accept for your kids, very rich people. You just wouldn't. And
Exactly.
that unfairness is, for me, I think is us not noticing and pushing back against that unfairness speaks to the dismantling and disruptions of democracy and a shared democracy, that we don't even see it or don't even really think it's worth bringing up. We just are sort of like, please don't take our public school system. We don't have that much left. You know, like, you're winning, you're eroding, you're winning. Can we fight for less? It's a little scary moment, I think, not to depress people here on a Saturday morning.
But Dr. Rooks, it really is. And I think acknowledging this and strategizing about what we can do, because, you know, giving up is not an option. And I love the way in your book and in your conversation today, you tie the very nature, the very soul of our country, right? Our democracy has been built on freedom to have our own voices, freedom to be educated and to learn and to make decisions and to vote. So everything that depends on that basic sound education that we've actually built our nations on. And the threatening of this and the disconnect that you're saying is startling and very frightening. I mean, help me tie this back, because as you're talking, I'm listening to, why don't these folks that are, you know, want the same for their kids, but they're wanting the other. I always am thinking while you're talking, how does this tie back to the Wall Street, to making the money, to the money motivation behind some of these attacks on public education? That, you know, I can afford to take my children and give them these things, but now I'm talking about making money or my investments. And how can we get Wall Street out of profiting from public education, taking our public education tax dollars?
You know, I mean, it's scary. It's almost impossible to think about in this particular, everything seems so precarious, right? And we're so divided. It's not even between Republican and Democrat. It's sort of authoritarian dictatorship and something else. I mean, what it's a little scary, but I think some of what I talk about in the book is how Wall Street in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when the whole free market rhetoric, it starts a little with Nixon and his embrace of an economist, Milton Friedman, and by the time we get to Reagan, who was big for free enterprise and let the market decide, the amount of money in the budgets, the overall budget for public education, which is like 600 billion. I mean, other than healthcare, there's just no other sector, as they like to call it, the public school space or the sector. There's nothing that has that kind of impact, and so few sort of controls over how it's spent. So it is ripe for kind of, let's come up with schemes that we can figure out how to get in there and make value for our shareholders. And that joining of hedge funds, Wall Street, and the open door, I mean, this is getting a little abstract, but I do think it's true, that kind of open door between our elected officials and folks who are coming from and going back to these entities and spaces where everything is make value for our shareholders, except the government part. No one's trying to make value for shareholders, and poor people and even middle-class people, we don't really have lobbyists to protect our interests in the same kinds of ways. I mean, if you're a part of one organization or another, like, I guess you could hope AARP is doing that for you, but these other folks that are billionaires or just multimillionaires, or just really, you know, we're arguing over, is $400,000 rich or not? I mean, you know, people who have access to that kind of money also have access to lobbyists who advocate for their interests in Congress. And in state legislatures, and pay basically to have their interests seen to. The turn that has to take place, like the only hope I think that we have is to disrupt that. As long as you have politicians who are beholden, in the story that I told about Detroit, you know, they undid the entire will of the voters in Detroit because two build people who are in the construction trades and are millionaires and were used to getting government contracts, use their contacts to go run to the governor and say, you know, this can't stand. We need you to turn it around. And the pressure from those kinds of moneyed people is what led the governor to turn the whole thing back, and figure out how to write democracy out of future bills so that it wouldn't even be possible for voters to come along and say, we don't want that. It's frightening to me in this moment as we are watching state legislatures do the same kind of thing around voting and around democracy, kind of say, we get to decide who wins an election. It doesn't matter who casts votes. It doesn't matter what the ballot box said. I mean, I think there's 8 legislatures who have now said, we get to determine and can turn over democratically elected votes. When you're looking at a larger kind of assault on society and democracy, I think education becomes a microcosm where you're watching that play out, where we're watching all of these elements have been taking place, you know, in different ways. But now it's literally threatening the whole. I mean, a lot of these privatization policies are parasitic. You know, you're kind of like, but you're draining, like the host. If the host is traditional education, all of these privatization things are killing the host at this point. And at this point, you're sort of watching all of it kill democracy. And that's my concern. Like right now, I'm like, yes, education is key, but I need to tie it to an erosion that's bigger than just education. Education has become the canary in the mine to me. It's almost like you can see the roadmap. You see the bedfellows. You see the arguments. And I think that's why I recognize the assault on democracy is because I've been studying these forces and these groups who have been trying to dismantle public education for so long. And I'm starting to hear the same slogans. I'm starting to hear the same rationales. I'm starting to see the same moves be made. Like this, I mean, the suspension of democracy, I had not seen another entity where before education, where all over the country, the first thing they did was attack school boards, dismantle school boards, you know, suspend democracy around school boards. So many places as a way of setting up privatization, as a way of saying it doesn't matter what you people want. We now have, you're only reporting to the governor and the governor just gets to decide now. You know, parents, it doesn't matter. We're watching that happen with our votes more broadly. And it's a similar kind of thing. And so I'd say we have to find those institutions we most want to defend and understand that in defending them, we are defending democracy. And we can't, it's not the time to get tired. It's not the time to back down. But I think we need to see the unraveling that's taking place. And those of us who have been working on education, people like you and your organization and people who've been doing this work, we understand the unraveling is real. We've seen it, you know, we fight it regularly. We see the tentacles in government. We see it. And so I think in that way, while I can't say that we have a way of saving this thing that we see and we care about and we're defending and will continue to defend, I think we have important stories to tell others who are just starting to see what's possible, what a undermining and a dismantling can look like. We know from our states, from our neighborhoods, from the whole narrative. We know that it is possible to wreck something that you think is a stable institution. You can do damage to it. And I think that those stories and those strategies and those groups that we work with, it's time to join forces, because education advocates again, do we get it? Y'all get it? Like, you get it.
Right.
And I think some other folks are just starting to see, like, wait a minute, this is a little bigger than one candidate. This is a little bigger. I mean, this is about an assault on democracy. And if we've been defending public ed, we get how they can assault democracy and tell you it is democracy.
Absolutely. And Dr. Rooks, what a wonderful answer to the question. And I have been listening to your every word as you talk about the threat to our democracy. And, you know, it means a lot. I think earlier somebody said the cornerstone of our democracy are public schools. We've always seen that in that tie. And now we see it moving over into other areas. We see it over to healthcare. We see it moving over to not just privatizing schools, privatizing many other services that support our economy and our government, and the value of public education, of making sure that we have educated voters, is critical. So I want to give you a chance. I think we've gotten most of the questions answered. I will tell you that you had a lot of positive response to involving students. A lot of voices said this silencing, this controlling the narrative for students and not letting them be more involved is critical. So we've got a lot of response on that. And someone wanted me to mention, you know, including National Coming Out Day on Monday, you know, a chance for students to have a voice and, you know, being an active part of their schools and being comfortable about that. But I want to give you a chance, kind of in summary, to see if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with us.
So let's see. I would say, while I can be doom and gloom a little bit, or not doom and gloom, but I'm trying to raise an alarm. I mean, if I sound alarmist, I believe that we are at a point where alarms should be raised. But at the same time, I really hope that we can share some of the stories, large and small, of folks who have won. Again, you know, from my presentation, I don't necessarily think that winning means that you've now overturned the system and it's all fine. But those stories of people who do win, if even for a moment, those stories where you create some breathing room, some space, where you can show that kids matter, that our institutions matter. We need more of those. While again, I'm raising an alarm and can be a little bit like, they're coming, you know, the British are coming. I have met some amazing people who are standing up as best they can. And yeah, we need more of those. And in all of our communities, in all of our organizations, we have those, large and small, that one teacher who saved the one student, or who got them to graduate, or, you know, the school that pushed back against those Teach for America teachers. I mean, we have them, we do. And so the one thing that I would say is, I think a great project is to collect those, just to let people know that it's not, that standing up matters, and standing up works, and that they're not alone when they do it. So I think that's what I would say.
Well, you've given us a lot of inspiration today, and we are going to take you to heart. I think that we get so busy sometimes talking about the alarming negative things that are happening, the stats, the feelings we're having. We do sometimes forget to look at the progress we have made. We still do have many great, wonderful public schools. We have a lot of wonderful, dedicated public education teachers. And we have a lot of parents and business owners and citizens in the world who still support strong public schools. So we got to tell our story. I'm listening to you. You've got to tell our story louder, better, We got to include students, and we cannot give up. And I think that's a great way to end our presentation here. Thank you again, Dr. Rooks. I
Thank you
appreciate you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been my pleasure.